From South Carolina Public Radio, this is the South Carolina Lead. I'm your host, Gavin Jackson, and this episode was recorded on June 16th, 2025, from Charleston, South Carolina. This episode of The Lead is one of two episodes dedicated to the 10-year commemoration of the Mother Emanuel AME Church shooting, where 9 black parishioners, including the pastor of the church, State Senator Clementa Pinckney, were murdered in a racially fueled massacre. In our pod today, we'll feature reflections from South Carolinians who participated in our Voices Collected initiative, as well as from folks who participated in the Charleston Forum last week, including politicians, law enforcement, and clergy who spoke of the last 10 years and where we go from here. The Charleston Forum is a space born out from the massacre on June 17, 2015, when South Carolina lost 9 of its own. Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who is the pastor of Mother Emanuel AME Church and a South Carolina state senator, Cynthia Graham Hurd, a longtime librarian at the Charleston County Public Library, Susie Jackson, a church member and a Bible study participant, Ethel Lee Lance, the well-known church sexton, DePayne Middleton Doctor, a pastor who also worked as a school administrator, Tawanza Sanders, a recent graduate of the historically black Allen University, Reverend Daniel Simmons, a pastor, Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, also a pastor, a speech therapist, and a track coach, and Myra Thompson, a Bible study teacher. They were the people murdered by the hands of hate by Dylan Roof, who worshiped with them before opening fire in the church in downtown Charleston, the oldest AME church in the South, a site specifically targeted for its significance to the black community, something the church is sadly no stranger to. That grief and the need to have those tough conversations that everyone talks about but never seems to get around to created the Charleston Forum back in 2016. I was at the 2017 event where Jennifer Pinckney, widow of Clementa, spoke of her late husband and the need to do more than talk.
I look at Clementa, and he was being the spiritual leader. He was not about hate. He was about love. He was about unity and coming together. And those who knew him and worship under him, that's what he preached about. That's what he talked about. Even the people that in the communities, in his district and so forth, he was about coming together. He was about love. And that's the same thing that it extended not only from home as him growing up as a youngster, from his parents teaching him that, to something that we instill in our daughters and that I still do today, but it was just an extension, and that was an extension of him too. I still think that we still have a long ways to go, that we're not there yet. I see issues in schools. I see where kids are called out of their name. Kids are being bullied and so forth. We're not where we should be, and it's sad that it took this tragedy for the flag to come down. It's sad that it took this tragedy for the positive things that have happened in South Carolina to happen. A lot of us, we have a tendency to talk about the problem, and that's all we want to do is talk about the problem and continue to talk about the problem, but we never want to get down into the muck and the grime of it and actually solve it. We can't always sit on the mountaintop. We got to get down and we got to work with the people. But we have to find out what the problem is. And once we find out what the problem is, then we can then begin to solve it. But if you have everyone just wanting to talk about it, then we're never going to get anywhere. And we're going to continue to have panels like this that's just always talking and no one doing anything.
Former Mayor Joe Riley, who was the mayor during the shooting, which occurred in his 10th and final term, spoke of how the community came together during that time.
When this most heartbreaking, horrific events occurred, that it's like, as I've said, that if you're mad because something happened, you don't light a fire in your own home. And this community, I feel, was together, and so our hearts broke together, and citizens naturally reacted by finding somebody to hug, finding someone, tears to wipe away, to hold hands, to pray, to join together, black and white, young and old, rich and poor. It was that foundational zeal and commitment of our community to build those bridges that I believe allowed us to withstand this most horrific event without being self-destructive.
This year's forum was not just a commemoration, but also an examination of what has been done and failed to be done over the years. The event opened with a beautiful and simple rendition of America the Beautiful by Penelope Grace Diaz and James Beckett Carrington.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties, above the fruited plain, America.
Reverend Alfred T.K. Zadig of St. Michael's Church offered a community prayer before the crowd of hundreds at the Charleston Music Hall.
Make no mistake about it, what happened in our city down the street 10 years ago was sheer, calculated, satanic evil. And tonight, we gather again to say, Satan, you lose. Tonight, as we look around this music hall, we see the evidence that Satan does lose because we know that we will see Clementa, Cynthia, Susie, Ethel, DePayne, Tawanza, Daniel, Sharonda, and Myron again.
The first panel was made up of community leaders, including current Mother Emanuel head pastor Eric S. Manning, who has led the historic church since 2016. Manning spoke of the constant need to fight against barriers that separate us.
Whether it's black, whether it's white, whether it's Protestant, whether it's Catholic, whatever the case may be from that particular perspective. It gives us a wonderful roadmap to draw people closer together. And I think that's what we have to do as leaders, right? I have to be willing to bridge that gap with my Christian brother or sister. And realistically, I can extend it even further, right? To anyone who is created in the image of God. Here's the answer, everyone is. So with that truth, with that fact, we should be able to bridge those gaps, those superficial things that we put up, and really get to know our neighbor and respect them as an equal. Unfortunately, a lot of times what happens, and what happened almost 10 years ago, is people have a way of looking at a particular race as being less than. And that is something that we still have to acknowledge, deal with, but then not stay there, but look for those ways to continue to bring our communities together. And I think faith leaders have a mandate to do just that. And I use the word mandate because realistically, not to make anyone feel uncomfortable, but we know better. And as we know better, then we must do better.
Charleston County Sheriff Carl Ritchie was elected in 2024. He previously served as Chief of Police for Mount Pleasant, retiring in 2021, and has 37 years of law enforcement experience. He spoke of the need to build community and trust with law enforcement to appropriately serve the community.
I think it's also important to recognize that when we're going to a call, law enforcement, it can be a very tense situation sometimes, and I've had to create a culture with my officers at my prior agency and now currently with the deputies that I'm working with to let them know that everything doesn't have to be confrontational. Compassion is part of our job. It's not a sign of weakness. That's understanding that when we're going into a community, that could be one of their worst time of their life, that we can make it better or worse. So I've had to make sure that when we go in there with that mindset that not everything has to be confrontational, and that your presence there will and can actually make a difference in somebody's life, and you can learn something from them, and just as they can learn something from us.
Marcus McDonald is the lead organizer of the Black Lives Matter Charleston movement. He said while politicians he works with are supportive in helping disenfranchised communities, there are still challenges. especially with funding to get things off the ground for community centers and mental health counseling. Caroline Murray asked him what the most pressing problem is right now in the community.
I think our youth are abandoned, especially our young adults right now, our teenagers. They feel lost. They went through the pandemic, isolated from their peers. They don't go out and party like other generations. The older generations are actually making it harder for them to party, putting curfews on them, making it harder for them to go out and do different things, making things more expensive, not allowing them to go to certain clubs if they don't have nice shoes or whatever. So I think really the young folks is really our main priority. They need to be, especially young males. We get left out of the conversation a lot of times and criminalized. And then when we get out of jail, there's no jobs for us. I have a lot of incarcerated friends right now who I grew up with, calling me from jail, still proud of me, proud that I'm doing things like this, proud that when they get out, they're gonna have somebody they could talk to and they could be with. But I know a lot of people don't have that. A lot of people don't have people that, when they come out, that a lot of people don't have nobody, especially when they're young, they're in their 20s, and then they get into that system. And that happens so many times. And that's one of the big issues, just getting caught in that system, being homeless. I've seen more homeless young people than I've ever seen in my life.
To the point about housing, access, and success, Kendra Scott, who is a political science professor and the Joseph P. Riley Jr. Center for Livable Communities director at the College of Charleston, said a person's zip code still determines much of their outcomes.
Some of the points Marcus was making that, what's the number one determinant of a lot of factors in your life? Your zip code, right? That's the number. A number of studies recently talk about how your zip code determines all kinds of health indicators, all kinds of financial success indicators, and so forth. And so first, there is at least now acknowledgement about intentionalism in determining space for people. And I think we are starting to see progress as far as people like Marcus or the Reverend, other folks bringing up how important it is to make decisions that space does allow equitable access to things like schools and public spaces. And, to what the Reverend said about bridging the gap, we know it's really important that we have shared space, that there's places where we can come together and have conversations. And so we are seeing much more recognition among public decision makers. But, as the Reverend said, faith leaders have a mandate. So do public officials have a mandate to ensure that space is becoming more equitable, and we're thinking in terms of how to correct past mistakes.
In between panels, Charlton Singleton, a founding member of the Grammy Award-winning ensemble Ranky Tanky, performed with his trumpet. Mayor William Cogswell is the second mayor of Charleston since Mayor Riley served for 40 years. Cogswell, a 50-year-old Charlestonian who represented the area in State House District 110 from 2016 through 2022, defeated Mayor John Tecklenburg in the 2023 election. He started off the second panel by acknowledging problems such as affordable housing on the Charleston Peninsula and what needs to be done.
When you look at the past 10 years since this tragedy happened, the reality of it is that the African-American population of the city of Charleston has dropped significantly, and we need to do more. And I think that has become a huge cultural issue because it's been such an important part of our history and part of who we are. So in terms of what the city of Charleston is doing, I would say the probably most primary objective that I have, and I think council shares this with me, is to increase affordability when it comes to housing. And that's something that local government, I believe, has a very strong role in, and we need to be very aggressive about tackling. So we've worked with the Bloomberg Foundation to come up with, to do a very deep dive in our housing market, if you will. And the results of that study, which were presented to City Council and various committees, were really startling. And so what our objective is now is to achieve 3,500 affordable units in our city over the next 7 years. To give you some perspective on how big of a challenge that is, over the past 8 years, we've delivered about 400 units. So a lot of work to do, but I feel like on our council, we're committed to making this happen because it's not just a housing issue, it's a huge cultural issue.
For Kylan Middleton, chairman of the Charleston County Council, the Mother Emanuel shooting was deeply personal because Clementa Pinckney was his best friend.
It has not been easy, and I can't believe it's been 10 years because we have been active, we have been dogged and resolute to make certain that Clementa Carlos Pinckney, at least, along with the other 8 who were massacred in the tragedy, and the survivors, Jennifer and Milana Pinckney being 2 of them, that their legacy was more than what happened on that day. I could not believe when I received the call from Jennifer because I just talked to them. They were coming down from Columbia, going to church as they normally would. They had a quarterly conference. I expected to talk to them after Bible study that night as we normally would have. And it was a total different conversation after the Bible study or when we finally reconnected at the conclusion of that evening. My son, who is now 29, working for the City of Charleston Police Department, and grown, I never imagined then having to step in, living in Charleston, going back and forth to Columbia. Eliana Pinckney just graduated from Temple University last month. Milana is a rising senior. And so there was a need. I heard somebody say in the previous panel that you had to step in. I'm the godfather. I was there literally when they were both born. And so when their father was murdered, I found it to be my mission to be present every day or as often in the major moments of their lives as I possibly could. And so beyond being goddaughters, they're daughters. Beyond being, Jennifer's like a sister, just like he was a brother. And so we've known each other, for so long. And as I begin looking at all of the good things, because again, based on the things that the atrocity that happened on that day, out of that, came all of these, the Pinckney scholars, all the things that we can begin to articulate, enumerate, and list of the amplified good that the Pinckney Foundation continues to do, and then all of the associated foundations and causes that continue to lift the lives of these individuals.
Ninth Circuit Solicitor Scarlett Wilson secured a guilty plea from Dylan Roof instead of a state trial back in 2017. He pled guilty and was convicted of 9 murder charges, 3 attempted murder charges, and possession of a handgun during the commission of a violent crime. Roof was sentenced to 9 consecutive life sentences plus 95 years after receiving a federal death sentence in his federal trial. As for advancing her office's efforts, Wilson wanted to ensure justice was being administered fairly in her office's approaches to prosecution efforts, not relying on anecdotes, but rather data to determine fairness.
I wanted to know if my office was being fair. And we began that journey shortly before Walter Scott was murdered, and certainly before the Mother Emanuel massacre. Those things propelled us forward into looking into whether or not we were treating similarly situated people similarly. And the first challenge that I faced was there isn't much data for that because prosecutors, unlike law enforcement, aren't required to keep that sort of data. So we had to really roll up our sleeves and try to clean up our data, get it into a way that it could be measured. Then we had to begin collecting data so that we could continue to measure it. And I'll tell you, it was scary because I didn't know for sure how that data was going to pan out. And what we learned, and I was relieved that really for the most part, we are treating people fairly. There were a few little blips that you couldn't necessarily attribute to racism or race having an effect versus something else, but those were areas that we could look at and try to do better in. So the first challenge was just having a way to measure and to study these things. And what I soon realized too was that what I wanted my legacy to be for the solicitor's office here in the Ninth Circuit. I wanted it to be a requirement and a practice and a procedure for us to collect that data so that moving forward, whoever solicitor after me would be expected to do that as well.
Wilson also spoke of how her office is working to address discrepancies in the cash bail system, which has been a problem discussed for years when it comes to criminal justice reforms, especially for nonviolent, low-level offenders who may be stuck in jail because they can't come up with an arbitrary bail amount.
I'm not talking about murders. I'm not talking about armed robbers. I'm not talking about rapists. I'm talking about a nonviolent offender who may have a $2,000 bond set. If someone's been set a $2,000 bond, it's not because they're dangerous. That's just a number that somebody picked. And if a poor person can't make that bond, it doesn't mean they're more dangerous than somebody who's making a $150,000 bond for murder. So that's a problem. But one of the things that we're doing in my office to try to address this is studying low-level offenses, looking at those offenses where we've seen over time in looking at data that the charges are eventually dismissed because of a lack of evidence. And what we're doing is looking at those within weeks instead of months, instead of years, and discerning through experienced prosecutors whether or not that case is viable. And if it's not, get rid of it.
When it comes to the lessons learned after a decade following the tragedy that many have called domestic terrorism, Reverend Middleton said it's a matter of getting involved in ways you may not have thought of before.
So we have to continue the cadence so that the march and the song and the imperative of justice permeates, penetrates, and it begins to infiltrate every sector, every part of our society, every area, so that we can have parity and we can have just equity across the board among all of our citizenry. And then lastly, I never wanted to be a politician. Never, ever in my entire life. And in fact, I used to disdain them. You know, I'm not certain if I still don't, but not you, I'm just saying. I mean, I said, I resemble the remark, but I do recognize that you have to have a seat at the table. You have to be in the arena. You cannot be on the sidelines all the time thinking that you're going to change. I've learned the hard way that you can't change the system from outside the system. You got to get inside the system and get in a position where you are able to make the change from within. And so with every breath in my body, I don't know how long I'll live, but with each day God gives, I'm going to do something that'll make a positive difference.
So that's just a little recap there that I wanted to bring you an extensive coverage of the forum because it provided such a rich cross-section of this journey that the Charleston area and our state has been on since the tragedy. I also want to bring you some of the stories I heard from our Voices Collected initiative. These were moments and anecdotes from folks who were directly and indirectly affected by the events. You may remember many folks took to the streets in solidarity and support during those immediate days, and I wanted to share some of those stories, which may be hard to hear. The first person to speak with us was Harriet Belinda Robinson, who has lived in Charleston most of her life. She grew up in the church and was close to many of the victims. She was a school teacher and then became involved in the Charleston tourism industry and is an interpreter at the McLeod Plantation on James Island. Here's Harriet explaining her job and her connection to the tragedy. And like many people I spoke with for this project, she refused to say the shooter's name, including the eerie connection between him and the plantation.
I take the narratives and the stories of the enslaved and I present a tour from the perspective of the enslaved. We're a member of the International Coalition Sites of Conscience, and so what that means is that we tell the story of slavery from the perspective of the enslaved. And so some things I say might be hard to hear or hard to digest, but it's from the perspective of the enslaved. My first memory was I was leaving school that day. I did not get my classroom closed down and I didn't get my apartment closed down before the end of school. So I came back up and one of my coworkers told me, be careful going to Charleston. I heard somebody shooting at some churches down there. I make it home and my parents told me that Pastor Pinckney was gone, but they didn't know about anybody else quite yet. And so I was in shock. And I stayed up all night watching CNN and just crying, thinking, how could people be so cruel? I was very hurt especially when we started finding out exactly who was gone. And I was very, very angry. I just couldn't believe that they were gone. I couldn't believe that something like this happened at the church. I couldn't believe that somebody just walked in and did this. They were my parents' church family and my church family growing up. And it took a minute to get there because I was always angry. I was always scared also that something else would happen. But if the families could forgive, I have to forgive. And honestly, I was very afraid. It's just because they hadn't caught him yet. And you didn't know who, or if it was more than one person, you didn't know who did what. And so it was a real time of fear. The day of Pastor Pinckney's wake, I had worked at the Joseph Manigault House. I'd asked the Charleston Museum if I could stay, let my car stay there, and I'll just walk over. And when I got to the church, Mr. Charles Williams asked me if I could recognize some of the people. And I said, some of the older ones, yes. And so I was put on the door where the members would enter. And from 5 to about 8:30, I was on that door greeting people as they came in. The streets they had people on the streets or whatever when I first arrived, and I thought I was very late. And an older gentleman let me in to the church. And then we were lining up to march to the arena. And I remember it being very hot. And it was still numb. I didn't like the feeling of being afraid. It was just surreal. It was just awful that happened to him. Well, I came out here to a Charleston Tourism Association meeting, and at the time, Toby Smith was giving us a tour. And we were in the house, and she was pulling out pictures, and she basically explained that the young man who committed the massacre had been out here 1 month before. And he had been over to the great burial grounds. He was in front of the big house here, and he was also in front of Transition Row. And so I found that to be very, very intriguing because I had heard he was downtown. I had heard he had been at the College of Charleston and all over, but I didn't know he was out here. And I wanted to add that story. That's something that stuck out to me. That's something that meant something to me. And I wanted to make sure that story was always told. It's hard to believe that 10 years later that there are people who've never heard of the story because it was worldwide. But I'm doing my part and other people are doing their parts to tell the story, so it's getting out there. The families did something very brave and they chose to forgive. This city didn't go up in the flames. Nobody tore this city up. And it had to be hard to forgive. I grew up in Mother Emanuel, and out of the 9 victims, my family and I knew 6 of them. My father and Miss Susie Jackson were on the church trustee board at one time. Miss Cynthia Hurd always greeted me when I went into the John L. Dart Library. I remember teaching Reverend Myra Thompson's daughter in Sunday school when I was a teenager. I could always remember seeing Miss Ethel Lance's smile anywhere throughout the church when she ushered. I remember my mother telling me that Reverend Sharonda Singleton had told her to be ready because she was coming to commune her and my father that week, but she never made it because Wednesday happened. And Pastor Pinckney was my parents' pastor. At the time of the massacre, I worked in the same school district as his wife, and this is communication that we received the day after. And it was to help her, just remember her, Mrs. Pinckney.
Ava Ayers is 31 years old and is the granddaughter of Reverend Daniel Lee Simmons Sr., her dad's father, who died in the shooting. When we brought you Don Lundy's story of responding to the shooting, you may recall how he spoke about one victim being transported to the hospital. That was Reverend Simmons. Here's Ava.
much of my life. I remember we grew up in Virginia, so when we would visit him, we would always have to go to church on Sunday, and we would watch him preach, and then he would try to make us sing and clap along and participate in his sermons. He was really big with coming in and surprising us with visits and saying, hey, I'm in town, let's go out to eat, let's go visit this. And then giving us a true Charleston-like experience when we did come down to South Carolina, and we would stay with him. That was much of what I remembered about him. 10 years later, I was just telling someone, 10 years now I can just take a deep breath. 10 years ago, I was still in school, much more younger, and it kind of just jolted me. And I think I just kept going. And now I'm like, it's been a decade, and there's so much to remember. There's so much to embrace. There's so many stories. There's so many beautiful things that have come about, but there was also so much to process. Just getting around to realizing my grandfather passed away a very national, tragic way, but he had so much life to live, and so many beautiful things came out of it. So I'm just getting to that point where I can kind of coast and talk about it more and be well with what has happened. I was home. I was a commuter student, so I was at home that night, long day of classes, and I'm trying to rest in my room, and my mom and dad are just like pacing the floor. And I'm like, what is going on? And they have every TV on at the house. My dad is on the phone, and I'm like, what is happening? And then we see my grandfather kind of glimpse past on a gurney, and I'm like, that looks like Granddaddy. And my dad was like, it was a shooting. I'm like, a shooting where? He's like, at Bible study. I'm like, we're home, what Bible study? He said, in Charleston. I'm like, is that Granddad? And he's like, yeah. And so I think I just stood there. Because at that point, my dad's walking out the door. So then it's just my mom and I'm like, we have to get ready to go, don't we? And she's like, yeah, this is big. And I'm like, yeah, if it's on the news here, this isn't a random shooting. This is something big. We gathered ourselves, and my little sister came along with us, and we started to drive down to South Carolina. And as we're in the car, the more real it became that something tragic has